thank you all so much for joining us this evening for a very special guest lecture that we have. The subject of tonight's presentation is a man who is currently keeping company with George W. Bush, Keith Richards, and Jay-Z. His recently released autobiography is being called The Dad Gift Book of the Holiday Season, and so far has reached number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list, and yet he's been dead for 100 years. Well, even now, 100 years after his passing, Mark Twain, always a man ahead of his time, remains the it person of today, a pop icon with critical acclaim that continues to fascinate us all. A prolific, poignant, and political writer, Twain has been dubbed by many as the father of American literature, using realistic language and themes to popularize his writings and convey his social commentary, most notably with what has been dubbed by many as the great American novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And tonight, November 30th, 2010, we are celebrating the 175th birthday of this classic American writer with a lecture entitled As Webster is My Witness, Language, Lies, and Laughter in Mark Twain. In the next hour, we will learn about the ways in which speaking and misspeaking are used to convey the satire and seriousness of Mark Twain's fiction. It's a presentation on one of literature's most beloved authors by one of Darien Library's most beloved guest lecturers. Our speaker for this evening is currently the Associate Dean of Yale University's Yale College, as well as Dean of Academic Affairs. He received his PhD in English Literature from Columbia and has taught at Columbia, New York University, and Trinity College in Hartford. In 2001, he was the recipient of the Wilbur Cross Award for Outstanding Humanities Scholar, presented by the Connecticut Humanities Council. And I think he's reaching icon status similar to that of Mark Twain, as proof of the audience that we have tonight. We are so happy that he's here with us once again. So please won't you join me in welcoming back to Darien Library, Dr. Mark Schenker.
She managed to get applause out of you twice. So I'm relieved that I don't have to compete with George Bush and Keith Richards. Part of that. My talk tonight is entitled As Webster is My Witness, Language, Lies, and Laughter in Mark Twain. It focuses largely on Huckleberry Finn, Twain's masterpiece and one of the great works of American literature of any decade, but it goes more broadly than that. And I will say there are seats down front. I have no objection to waiting a few minutes if people want to come down. If people won't move over, walk over them. But there are at least, well, I'm serious, there are at least a dozen empty seats I can see. The talk is a lot more entertaining if you're sitting. So my focus this evening is on how Twain's works allow us to luxuriate in the uses of language, not just language in the service of a character or a narrative or event, but language as art, language as an expression of life, even an extension of life itself. Twain played with language in a self-conscious way to evoke laughter, to exaggerate the truth, and even to create lies intentionally in the service of truth. In Huckleberry Finn, there is the famous scene in chapter 31 in which Huck, having written a letter to Miss Watson, telling her where she can find her runaway slave Jim, tells us that he, quote, felt all good and washed clean of sin for the first time, and that he felt that he would now be able to pray. That is, he thinks he's doing the right thing by turning in a freed slave. But before he can do this, he starts to think about the physical fact of the letter he's holding. And he starts to think about Jim and how, quote, he would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could think of for me, and how good he always was to me. And then Huck continues, Jim said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper, the letter he wrote. It was a close place. He's in a hard predicament. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I noted. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then I says to myself, All right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. For Huck, this act of reversal is not a triumph, but it's a falling back into wickedness, because he believes, as his distorted Southern culture has taught him to believe, that helping a runaway slave is tantamount to stealing the property of another. For the reader, Huck's tearing up the letter is heroic, since we recognize that his innate goodness, what one critic has called his sound heart, has triumphed over his deformed conscience, a conscience corrupted by Southern culture that has implicitly made what it views as a moral defense of slavery. Huck thinks he's a bad boy. This turning point in the novel is very well known. What I want to add tonight is that for Twain, it's not enough that Huck just change his mind, or that he write the note and then decide not to have it delivered. Twain has Huck write the note and then destroy it. A fitting action for our muddle-headed but strong-hearted hero, because it enacts the physical destruction of the words of betrayal. The note gets torn up because it's a lie that is destroyed in the novel by the larger truth of Jim's humanity, his goodness, and his loving relation to Huck. In the face of that reality, the lying words lose, and they don't just go unsaid or unwritten. Their saying, their writing, is negated by Huck's destruction of the letter. That is, his silence in not betraying Jim is not passive, but active. But of course, this unintentionally heroic action, remember, Huck does think he's doing a bad thing, is conveyed to us through words, through Huck's own words, and part of the magic of the novel is the way in which Twain's skillful creation of Huck as a first-person narrator convinces us of the utter reality of this boy who is made out of nothing but words. Words are Huck's own stock and trade. Not only does he seem to bring himself into being by telling his own story, so does any first-person narrator who's also a protagonist in the novel. Pip in Great Expectations, Holden Caulfield, Nick Carraway, many, many examples. But he continually lies to others in the novel, inventing false identities for himself and telling false histories and tall tales about who he is and how he came to be at a particular place. In chapter 11, he dons a dress and pretends that he's a girl named Sarah Williams. You'll want to remember that name. Huck does not remember it. Sarah Williams. In order to get news of what's happened back home in St. Petersburg. In the course of conversing with a suspicious woman, he's asked for his name again and mistakenly says, Mary Williams. He quickly realizes his error. Now I'm quoting. Somehow it didn't seem to me that I said it was Mary before, so I didn't look up. Seemed to me I said I was Sarah, so I felt sort of cornered, another close place, and was afeared maybe I was looking it too. I wish the woman would say something more. The longer she sat still, the uneasier I became. If you're a liar, silence is not your friend. But if she'll talk, he can talk back. This is very common in Huckleberry Finn. This is what I mean by this luxuriating in language. But now she says, honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first came in. Oh, yes, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some call me Sarah. Some calls me Mary. Oh, that's the way of it? Yes'm. Huck's recovery is immediate. He does not retract his lie. He extends it. But his deception is short-lived. The woman tests her suspicion that this girl is actually a boy by throwing something into his lap and watching as he clamps his legs together to catch it. The woman confronts Huck with her knowledge that he is indeed a boy, noting that, quote, when a girl tries to catch something in her lap, she throws her knees apart in order to make space in her dress-covered lap to catch the thing, while only a male would clap his knees together. Caught in this lie, Huck's recovery, again, is immediate, as he explains with another lie that his name is George Peters. and that he's an orphan who's been forced to work by a mean old farmer who has abused him. And so he's run away to seek the help of his Uncle Abner in the town of Goshen, and so on. You see, George Peters, mean old farmer, Uncle Abner, town of Goshen. He's a fiction writer, Huck. This lie works. While the woman chides him for his unsuccessful impersonation of a girl, noting that he might fool men, but never women, she advises him on how to get to Goshen and offers to help him if he gets into trouble there. Huck lies to others constantly in the novel, but significantly, he never lies to us. In chapter 26, in a pause from traveling with the bogus Duke and Dauphin, he is having a conversation over supper with a woman named Joanna, who asks if Huck has ever seen the King of England, since he says he's been to England. This is the novel. Who? William IV? Well, I bet I have. He goes to our church. Huck continues as an aside to the reader, I knowed he was dead years ago, but I never let on. In fact, William IV had died years ago, and it's typical of Twain that he would have Huck know this, even though how Huck would know this about William IV. I'm sure there are many people in this room who wouldn't know when William IV died. How would Huck? But anyway, in the exchange that follows, increasingly suspicious Joanna keeps catching Huck in a lie, and each time she does, he invents another lie to escape. Finally, when she can take no more of it, she says, Honest Injun now, hain't you been telling me a lot of lies? Honest Injun, says I. None of it at all? None of it at all. Not a lie in it, says I. Lay your hand on this book and say it. Well, not having a Bible available, simple Joanna has picked up the biggest book she can find, thinking, well, it looks like a Bible. But Huck tells us immediately that he sees it weren't nothing but a dictionary. So I laid my hand on it and said it. She then looked a little better satisfied and says, well, then I'll believe some of it, but I hope to gracious if I believe the rest. The substitution of the dictionary for a Bible makes a point about Joanna's gullibility, and of course it also gives Huck, who is seriously fearful of damnation, a way out, a way to avoid giving a false oath. But the point that I want to stress this evening is that Huck, swearing to the truth of his lies on a dictionary, as Webster is my witness, is emblematic of the fact that for Twain's remarkable literary creation, Huck, words themselves, and not the word of God, are his testament. It is as if Twain has comically had Huck affirm his ever-inventive identity on the very book that makes identity creation possible. Huck is not just a boy that Mark Twain made out of words. He constantly reinvents himself through lies that testify to his own resourcefulness and to Twain's comic genius. Of course, it matters mightily that Huck's lie is entertaining to us and not really harmful to Joanna. Twain had no love for a lie that does harm. In an essay entitled On the Decay of the Art of Lying, published in 1895, the same year as Huckleberry Finn, Twain states that, quote, an injurious lie is an uncommendable thing. But he goes on to suggest that it is not the lie per se that made it bad, but rather the fact that it does injury. And so he adds that equally bad is an injurious truth. In chapter 15 of Huckleberry Finn, Huck learns a lesson about the nature of an injurious lie. He is utterly abashed when Jim scolds him for Huck's having made Jim believe that the storm that they just survived on the raft was all a dream. Jim is angry because while he was being grateful that his beloved Huck survived the storm and capsizing his canoe, all Huck was interested in, says Jim, was thinking about how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. Huck learns his lesson. After 15 minutes, he works himself up to apologize to Jim, realizing that for himself and for many readers, this means that he has humbled himself to apologize to a black man. But he adds, but I done it, apologized. I weren't ever sorry for it afterwards neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't done that one if I knowed it would make him feel that way. Huck regrets his lie, not because lying is immoral, but because his lie hurt Jim. Twain makes the same serious point in a more satirical way in the essay On the Decay of the Art of Lying. And I'll say that Twain in America in the 1890s is writing about lying in this way with an affinity to novel making, to artistry, to telling fictions. And in the same decade in England, a very, very different writer, Oscar Wilde, is making the same point when he talks about the fact that in distinction or in opposition to the Romantic movement at the beginning of the century, that art came from sincerity, that Wordsworth and Coleridge and Yeats and Whitman in America found that you could make art out of talking about yourself, singing about yourself. Wilde says in Europe, any idiot can tell the truth. It takes an artist to lie. And Oscar Wilde's plays and works are also centered on people who luxuriate in language and make things up. My name is John, but you want to marry a man named Ernest? My name is Ernest. And makes a pun on the importance of being earnest and so on. So this notion in the same decade at opposite sides of the Atlantic from two very different writers, Twain and Wilde, makes the point that one of the movements in the 19th century is away from sincerity as not being artistic, a kind of rebellion against the Romantic Revolution, and for sort of art for art's sake in a way. Anyway, that's a separate topic, but they're related. So in that essay, he makes the same serious point in a more satirical way. And here's the excerpt. Lying is universal. We all do it. Aren't you relieved? Therefore, the wise thing for us to do is to train ourselves to lie thoughtfully, judiciously, to lie with a good object and not an evil one, to lie for others' advantage and not for our own, to lie healingly, charitably, humanely, not cruelly, hurtfully, maliciously, to lie gracefully and graciously, not awkwardly and clumsily, to lie firmly, frankly, squarely, with head erect, not haltingly, tortuously, with pusillanimous mien as being ashamed of our high calling. Now, this isn't a lie exactly, but it's a goof. I mean, this is someone who's using those adverbs because he's making the point of the relationship between lying and language, how you can luxuriate in the feel of language by expression, by lying. Then shall we be rid of the rank and pestilent truth that is rotting the land. Then we shall be great and good and beautiful and worthy dwellers in a world where even benign nature habitually lies, except when she promises awful weather. Neither Huck nor Twain, however, has patience for the incidental lies that make up so much of polite society. Does this make me look fat? In that same supper scene in chapter 26, before Huck tells his string of lies to Joanna about his experiences in England with the king, Huck notes that throughout the meal, their host, Mary Jane, spent her time saying, quote, how bad her biscuits were, and how mean the preserves were, and how ornery and tough the fried chicken was, and all that kind of rot, the way women always do to force out compliments. And the people all know that everything was tip-top and said so. Said, how do you get the biscuits to brown so? Where, for land's sake, did you get those amazing pickles? And all that kind of humbug talky talk. Just the way people always does his supper, you know. Now, the reason Huck has no patience for that is that he's an adolescent boy. But the reason Twain has no tolerance for that is it's not lying as invention. It's lying as cliche. There's nothing imaginative, there's nothing new, there's nothing expressive about it. It doesn't mean anything. The lies that Huck practices and the lies that Twain promotes are not these social lies, but rather the lies that are products of the artistic imagination. They are lies that are performances, inventions of personality by a personality, true of both Twain and Huck in different ways. A personality who is always an exuberant and enthusiastic participant in an observer of life and society. Huck's lies come close to literary creation and have a kinship with the American tall tale that was a staple of 19th century American life and journalism, a form which Twain himself practiced and perfected. In Twain's fiction, these performing liars, if they do no harm, are invariably praised as entertainers, and sometimes as artists. Think again of Oscar Wilde. Any idiot can tell the truth. It takes an artist to lie. There's a scene in The Importance of Being Earnest where one of the women is doubtful about what one of the men is explaining to her. And she says, the suspense is unbearable. I pray it will last. And the reason that's funny is that we like suspense. That's why people go to plays and movies. In life, we want the answer right away. But in this way in which these characters think of art as life, and life as art, the longer you can be in suspense, the more exciting it is. That's why there are roller coasters. That's why there's CSI Miami, or take your pick. In the same play, a character says, I want your explanation, and I ask you, make it improbable. Because improbable will be more fun. Huck's lies come close to literary creation. These performing liars, if they do no harm, are invariably praised as entertainers and sometimes as artists. In the private history of the campaign that failed by Twain, a man is referred to as, quote, an experienced, industrious, ambitious, and quite often picturesque liar. The emphasis falls, of course, on that artful last adjective, picturesque. In Following the Equator, a non-fiction travelogue that Twain published in 1897, he satirically comments, truth is the most valuable thing we have. Let us economize it. But even as we might be comically counseled to economize the truth, Twain would note that we should always feel invited to spend ourselves in language. And so I return to that image of Huck swearing an oath on a dictionary. In 1900, Twain lived from 1835 to 1910. In 1900, some 15 years after the publication of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Twain, who was never shy about commercial profit, allowed himself to be used in a newspaper advertisement for an endorsement of a dictionary. The ad quoted Twain as saying, in my experience, I have found that one can do without principles, but not without the Funk and Wagnall's Standard Dictionary. For the title of this evening's talk, I went with Webster's over Funk and Wagnall's for the purposes of alliteration only. Somehow, as Funk and Wagnall's are my witness, didn't seem to have the same ring. Before I leave the subject of dictionaries, I should observe that Twain is also reported to have said of the book, I have studied it often, but I could never discover the plot. And when I say that he wasn't averse to commercial profit, Twain is probably the first literary superstar, and maybe the first superstar of any character. You'd have to put Lincoln up there, in the sense that the Twain that we see, think Hal Holbrook, white-suited, white-mustached, the white hair, the cigar, that kind of older Twain, that was an iconic image that he very much cultivated. And the brand of Mark Twain was something that he was very careful to promote. Because Huck Finn was so popular in serial publication, Twain worried when he published it as a book that some people would forget that Huckleberry Finn didn't exist. Some people would forget that Mark Twain made Huckleberry Finn in the same way that many people know Sherlock Holmes and fewer people know Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle didn't have that worry, but Twain did. So when he published The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as a volume, he not only has Huck say at the beginning, you know something about me if you read a book called Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Get it? But he also has notes at the beginning from the author saying that anyone looking for a plot in this novel will be shot, And in the hardcover edition, he had a photograph of a bust of him, as if he were a Greek author, like Homer, and his signature underneath it. It's his way of saying, please pay attention to the man behind the curtain. I made this book, and it shows a kind of poignant and maybe embarrassing desire on his part to make sure that we don't forget that he made these things. So these lies, these picturesque performances in language that characterize Huck and so many figures in Twain's fiction and tales are rooted in a celebration of language itself. And of course, one of Twain's great achievements is capturing the cadence and character of American speech. You have to encounter different dialects when you read Huckleberry Finn. Twain's form of the tall tale is a tale. It is a telling. It has a teller. In a letter responding to a young writer's request for literary advice, Twain wrote, "You already write as a man talks, and very few can reach that height of excellence." In a manner that is decidedly American, Twain's own comments on writing and the English language continually emphasize process over product. In an English notebook, he wrote, expression is the thing of art. I don't care what it expresses, and I cannot tell generally, but expression is what I worship. It is what I glory in with all my impetuous nature." It's easy to see how the combination of an impetuous nature and a love of expression for its own sake, whether in Twain or Huck, could lead to statements that are something short of the truth. And through his writings, Twain consistently plays with the idea of the comic uses of lying. In Pudd'nhead Wilson, he notes that one of the differences between a cat and a lie is that a cat has only 9 lives. And in a letter to a friend, Twain wrote about himself, "I would rather tell 7 lies than make 1 explanation." In chapter 1 of Huckleberry Finn, Huck tells us, as I noted earlier, that in Mark Twain's book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Twain told the truth mainly. This is a quote. "There are things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That's nothing. I have never seen anybody that lied one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly or the widow, or maybe Mary. Aunt Polly, Tom's Aunt Polly she is, and Mary and the widow Douglas is all told about in that book, which is mostly a true book, which some stretchers, as I've said before. It's just what you want in someone, to hear that most of what they tell you is true. But you see, it's another way of working in that Mr. Twain wrote this book, this other book, that is, of course, true and not true." In having his fictional creation, Huck Finn, comment on Twain's truthfulness, Twain sets up a kind of literary echo chamber. Twain creates Huck, who comments on Twain's creation of the fictional Tom Sawyer, and argues about whether what he made up is true or not. The sense we're left with is that the truth stretching of the tall tale, the kind that Huck or Tom might tell, is on a continuum with the more serious enterprise of novel writing. It's a matter of degree. More generally, Twain suggests that the potential for exaggeration and untruth is an aspect of language itself. In Following the Equator, he comments, "Language is a treacherous thing, a most unsure vehicle. Ask King Midas about the difficulties of figuring out what to wish for." That's me, not Twain. Language is a treacherous thing, a most unsure vehicle, and it can seldom arrange descriptive ways in such a way that they will not inflate the facts. By help of the reader's imagination, which is always ready to take a hand and work for nothing, and do the bulk of it at that, readers will help you in misconstruing what you say. So it's not just that writers lie, it's that readers want lies. Make your explanation, and please make it improbable, says the character in The Importance of Being Earnest. And that the readers will, in fact, do most of the heavy lifting in collaborating with an author's inflation of the truth. Now, Twain was not, of course, above commenting on honesty and lying, on speech and silence, for the apparent purpose of being only witty or cynical. And so if you're ever around a quotation dictionary, one of the people with the most entries always is Mark Twain. He's up there with Oscar Wilde and Samuel Johnson and a few other people. He said that honesty is the best policy when there is money in it. He said, get your facts first, and then you can distort them as much as you please. He said, I have been through some terrible things in my life, some of which actually happened. Keep that in mind as you read the autobiography. He said, the right word may be effective, but no word has ever been as effective as the rightly timed pause. Saying and not saying. And lastly, that a lie is an abomination before the Lord and an ever-present help in time of need. Twain wrote an essay in 1900 in response to the inquiry, what was the first lie you ever told? He begins his piece entitled, My First Lie and How I Got Out of It, by explaining that he cannot in fact remember the first time he lied, since it's too far back in his memory to recall. He then adds the comic effect that his readers will have to settle for his second lie, which he told when he was 9 days old. The lie was that after learning that if he cried when a diaper pin was sticking into him, and he was lovingly petted and coddled and pitied in the most agreeable way and got a ration between meals besides, he soon took to advertising a pin, that is, crying even when he wasn't stuck. He explains that it was merely human nature to want the riches of this extra attention. He writes, you would have done it. George Washington did it. Anybody would have done it. George Washington, who never told a lie, would pretend he had a pin sticking in him even when he didn't. Twain then adds that up to 1867, all the civilized children that were ever born into the world were liars, including the father of our country. Well, what happened in 1867 that changed things? Twain goes on to explain that the safety pin was invented in that year. I want to say that he was actually off by 18 years. You see that he doesn't worry too much about accuracy. The safety pin was actually invented and patented by a mechanic from New York named Walter Hunt in 1849. But Twain knew that sometime in his lifetime, sticking pins were replaced by safety pins. You see the point of the kind of charm that he has in making up a lie and then telling a truth that he doesn't have quite right. He goes on to explain that this early reform of his lying was not worth anything morally because it was reformed by force. They took away the pins. And that has no virtue in it. It merely stops the form of lying, he says. It doesn't impair the disposition to lie by a shade. We all want to lie. We all want to hear lies. But Twain has more than comic effect on his mind in this essay on his first lie. He goes on to generalize that almost all lies are acts, and speech has no part in them. Remember, the lies that he is most against are the ones that injure, and there are some lies that injure without your having to say a word. He says, I'm speaking of the lie of the silent assertion. We can tell it without saying a word, and we all do it. So he refers here to lies that do not involve language, the love of words, the enthusiasm for expression. Instead, the absence of all those things. He gives the example of the silent lie by which Northerners were for years complicit in the support of Southern slavery. They said nothing, and that action, the action of saying nothing, was a lie. And so we've come back to Huck's instinctive sense that for all his guilt in tearing up the note that would have re-enslaved Jim, he was right to destroy it because it was a lie that would have injured another. Twain counts the tacit support of the system of American slavery as one example of many, quote, gigantic mute lies, which, he says, whole races and peoples conspire to propagate in the interest of tyranny and shams. This is the same essay with the safety pin in George Washington. This is Twain. He's dead serious. It's not talking, it's sometimes not talking. There's a social psychologist that says that it might be better to define the human species not as Homo sapiens, mankind the wise, but Homo nagens. We are the only race that can say no. The no that you'd say to the Nazis, the no that you'd say to the KKK. That's what they're talking about. That's what he's talking about. Twain counts the tacit support of the system of American slavery as one example of many gigantic mute lives which whole races and peoples conspire to propagate in the interest of tyrannies and shams. In comparison to these lives of silence, he writes, why should we care about the trifling lives of individuals? Why should we try to make it appear that abstention from lying is a virtue? Now keep in mind, he's being quite serious about celebrating the flexibility of truth when you're entertaining. It's what it means to be a fiction writer. It's what it means to be a teller of tall tales. And that's why he tells us a tall tale. I can't tell you my first lie, I'll tell you my second. It was when I was 9 years old. He gives us a date because it sounds better if he has a date. He didn't look the date up, he wasn't sure of it, but it's better with a date. In the same way that it was better, the lie that Huck told, if he could say my Uncle Abner instead of my uncle, or Goshen instead of someplace over there. Really good liars know that details matter. Twain concludes his essay by explaining that by examination and mathematical computation, I have found that the proportion of the spoken lie to all other varieties is as 1 to 22,984. He goes on to say, therefore the spoken lie is of no consequence, and it is not worthwhile to go around fussing about it and trying to make us believe it's an important matter. The silent, colossal, national lie that is the support and confederate of all the tyrannies and shams and inequalities and unfairnesses that afflict peoples, that is the one to throw bricks and sermons at. But let us be judicious and wait for somebody else to begin. That's the end of that essay. And so the piece makes a quite serious point about the evil done by silence and inaction, and ends as it began with a joke, but a somber one. The best of Mark Twain is rarely far from his comic nature. Whether it is employed for the sake of sheer entertainment, he noted that he was so good looking as a young man that during the rainy season in San Francisco, he was mistaken for fair weather. It's got to be one of the funniest things anyone has ever said. Whether it was for that kind of entertainment or to make the kind of satirical tack that he was famous for. In The Mysterious Stranger, 1916, he notes that against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand. Only laughter can blow a colossal humbug to rags and atoms at a blast. Twain knew that colossal humbugs, whatever they might be, existed through the complicity of silence, like the great national lie of slavery, and that the laughter that can turn those humbugs to dust derives from the range and vitality of the English language to which he gave his particular American spin. That is Webster's English language, Huck's language, again, swearing by his Bible. When William Dean Howells praised Mark Twain as the Lincoln of our literature, he had in mind another man of the frontier who spoke to and for the common folk of the American heartland, and whose stature grew in eminence as America developed into a continental nation. He might also have had in mind what I hope I've suggested here today, that like Lincoln, Twain was a man of powerful eloquence and easy, folksy humor, a man whose voice is conveyed in his writing, a man who was both a humorist and a moralist, and lastly, a man who was not distracted by the incidental stretching of truth in tall tales and spoken anecdotes, not distracted from the business of demolishing the lies that remain unspoken. Thank you. So I'm happy to take some questions with the caveat that I think the audience would be most interested in questions that actually come out of what I've just talked about, rather than interesting facts about Mark Twain. And that's not only because I may not know some interesting facts about Mark Twain, but I hope there's enough food for thought in what I've talked about this evening that you'll have questions that derive from either what I've said or something that what I've said occasions. So I am happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
With regard to his sense of humor, was he ever called Choo Choo Twain?
You see what I mean? Yes, sir.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about Mark Twain as the moralist? And how much of that is of his personality?
Yeah, well, I want to say I think it's the nature of satirists to be moralists. I think we have to distinguish between somebody who just lampoons, someone who just makes fun of something, and someone who actually satirizes. From the literary point of view, and Twain was very conscious of being a literary writer, a satire is written by someone who believes that there is a standard of behavior and that it's not being met. Well, if you believe there's a standard of behavior, you're a kind of moralist. And if you believe the standard's not being met and you decide to prod people into meeting it by making fun of them, that's where the satire comes from. But it's always grounded in moralism. So for example, Huckleberry Finn makes use of the N-word, and it's caused a lot of problems for middle school and high school teachers who are burdened, and I'm sympathetic to this, with trying to explain, especially to a mixed race class, why the novel is still a great novel despite that word. And attempts to remove the word, as people have done because the book is out of copyright, by putting slave in its place, or even black man, as has been done, misses the point of the power of that word to hurt. Now, Twain was not as sensitive to it as we are, but he was absolutely sensitive to the notion that Southern society made Jim something less than a man. And that when he has Huck apologize to Jim for making fun of him, and have Huck feel that it took him 15 minutes to work himself up to apologize to a black man, Twain is having his cake and eating it too. He's recognizing that the system of slavery, of inequality, is so strong that even a good kid in heart, as Huckleberry Finn, has difficulty bringing himself to do the right thing, but he does the right thing. And I think there are examples time and time again in Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and other books of Twain coming out on the side of moralism. Later in his life, he had a number of personal and business catastrophes, and he became more bitter. He became darker. He has an essay in which he says that they found a fossil of the first man, first human being, and he describes how the body is situated. And if you read it carelessly, you just notice that he's saying something about the hands and fingers. But what he says is that if you look, the body's going like this. And again, if you miss the point, if you don't read it carefully, if you think it's quasi-anthropological, scientific, you think it's just factual. But in the middle of this fact, like the safety pin, he's having a joke. But when later in his life he came to write Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and if you've seen the Hollywood musical with Bing Crosby, you've not read the novel. Because in the novel, the New England auto mechanic decides that the way he's going to bring modernism to the court of King Arthur is that he invents for them the Gatling gun. And Arthur's side wins by bringing the 19th century into the 8th. His argument is this is what progress is. Progress is being able to kill more people faster. And in the novel, the romance of King Arthur is completely pushed aside by the bitterness of Twain saying this is what human progress comes to. Thomas Hardy, who was born in 1840, so was a contemporary on the other side of the Atlantic again with Twain, lived to the age of 88, died in 1928, so he not only saw and wrote about the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, but about the First World War. He makes a similar kind of comment, Thomas Hardy, another moralist, by saying in a poem entitled Christmas 1924, I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty close, it's very short. Merry Christmas, so we sing it, and we pay 1,000,000 priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of Christian Mass, what we have is just the gas of the trenches of the First World War, 1924. Within 10, 15 years, there's going to be another kind of gas in Europe. Also the result of technology. These guys knew something about where civilization was heading. And the darkness is part of their moralism. Even though there's a lot of comedy in Mark Twain, especially the earlier Mark Twain. Yes?
I love your topic, luxuriating in language. So my question is not to say that that's not a great topic, because I thought it was great, but there must have been so many choices for you to talk about this evening. How did you land on it?
Well, first I got rid of Choo-Choo Twain. It was tough. I chose this partly because, and I've given this talk before, but I've chosen it each time because I feel that Twain is one of those people that almost everybody knows and has read something about. And so I don't have to tell you everything there is to know about Huckleberry Finn. But I think many people who haven't studied him or read much of him don't have an appreciation for how seriously you can take Mark Twain. And so the luxuriation in language, you know, people who are musicians, and I'm sure there are people here, they love music. They find that they're humming or dancing or tapping out music. It doesn't have to mean anything. It's expression. It's expression in sound and rhythm. In Singing in the Rain, the guy who was either directing or choreographing that said, I hate this idea that all of a sudden somebody, even in a musical, just starts singing. I'd like to have something more realistic. So they told Gene Kelly that as he's walking in the rain, start humming. And he starts, da, 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 da. And then he starts singing in the rain. The movie's called Singing in the Rain. It shouldn't come as a shock. He sings in the rain. But his first instinct is to hum. I think writers, people who love language. And it's not an invitation to lie, but it's certainly permission to play around. And so I thought that this was a good general topic that was also rooted in a number of scenes. I think you have a better understanding of Huckleberry Finn, which I do think is his masterpiece, if you think about how that throwaway scene of having Huck swear on a Bible that's not a Bible is not just a joke on Joanna. It's really a celebration of what language makes possible. I can't be the only person in this room who had fun growing up or recently by looking through the dictionary, and not just for the dirty words. Turns out the dictionary is good reading. So,
No plot.
yes.
You've got the, after the flood when Jim finds Cap's body and doesn't tell Huck, so there's a lie there. And there's two schools of thought. One is that he was doing it to protect Huckleberry from that knowledge, and the other is he thought he was going to lose the meal ticket if he told him. And then it's compounded at the end when Tom Sawyer has the lie of omission by not telling Jim that he's a freed slave and concocts the entire escape. I just wonder what your take on that was.
Yeah, those are two good points. I'll address the second one first. It's a famous issue. Twain struggled for a long time about how to finish the novel, because originally the idea was that they would escape at Cairo, Illinois, up to the north and be free. And that's when he invents the storm that sends them down south, because the whole point of the novel is for these wanderers, this society of two, a black man and a white boy, to experience what pre-Civil War Southern life was like. And so he struggled because he had an adventure story that had no ending. And many people think that the way he compromised was at the end of the novel, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer switch identities. They show up at Phelps Farm and they pretend to be each other. And so Huck starts acting like Tom, the sort of person who would risk a man's life for a game. It's certainly not the Huck that we've seen earlier, and I think most critics will agree that there's a kind of fudge at the end. It's a kind of, I don't know what to do, I'm just done. At the end of the novel, when Jim, we find out, has been freed all along and is a free man, and Huck is offered the money that he could have from the inheritance, his last words are, "I have to set out for the territory. I don't want any part of civilization. I've been there." And so he heads out as if there's an endless process of escape. So I have to say that's a troubling resolution for the book. But the lie that Jim tells, so early on in their escape, Jim goes aboard a riverboat called the Walter Scott, not an accidental name. Yeah. He finds a dead man, and he tells Huck not to look at it, and we find out many, many chapters later that at that moment, Jim knew that that was Huck's father. And I lean towards the reading that he didn't want to tell him because he didn't want to upset a young boy, not knowing what his relationship was with his father. I have heard people suggest the other thing. It's that, again, that's not the Jim that I recognize. But more importantly is, why is the boat called the Walter Scott? Does anybody know? Yeah, please.
I know that Walter Scott was one of these flamboyant romantics, and the Southern gentry really took that up, all the fighting and the chivalry, and he was read by them.
Walter Scott is the guy who made the Southern gentry, who thought of themselves as English gentlemen, think that it was okay to do anything as long as you could ride a horse well. And you tipped your hat to the missus, including beat and torture slaves. Mark Twain said, with only some exaggeration, the American Civil War was the work of Walter Scott. He wasn't wholly kidding. It's the same hatred of the romance of King Arthur that has him make his Hank, his Connecticut Yankee, create a Gatling gun. Oh, we're also interested in the Knights of the Round Table when they kill people one at a time. But what if we gave them weapons of mass destruction? It's not so charming anymore. Twain believed that Walter Scott bred a sense of Southern chivalry that was amoral at best and likely immoral, and made people who thought of themselves as Christian do despicable things. And so when dead pap is found on that boat of death, the Walter Scott, Twain is having a joke at his Southern reader's expense. Complicated guy. Yes?
How would you advise high school teachers to deal with not only the N-word, but portrayal of Jim as almost an adolescent in the guise of a man?
Yeah, so I'd advise them to have good teachers, and I'm not saying this glibly. If you're going to teach literature at any level, you have to be ready for tough questions if you're going to teach real literature. I don't just mean writing, I mean stuff that stays. I am sympathetic to high school and middle school teachers who have to teach to a mixed race class, or worse, an all-white Connecticut suburban class, a novel that requires you to bring up this issue, to talk about this issue. It doesn't get solved if you pretend that the book doesn't exist. And some of the complexities that you raised and that you're raising about, for all of his good intentions, Jim still comes off as a kind of man boy. That's worth talking about. It's worth talking about whether any artist can truly transcend his own time period. And that Twain was trying to write a novel that gave the lie to slavery, and maybe he was also part of the problem. I think that's a conversation that's worth having. You don't have it if you do the novel and don't raise it, and you can never have it if you just avoid doing the novel. It's tough. But you know, the first time I taught Paradise Lost, yes, Paradise Lost, I had a student come up to me. I was teaching at Trinity College in Hartford, and she asked me very seriously if I were a Christian. And I asked her what relevance that had. This was the first day of class. The class was on Milton's Paradise Lost, the entire course. And her point was, if I wasn't a Christian, she didn't want to be in a course listening to an academic who didn't believe what he was teaching. And she dropped my course. Serious stuff. Yes?
He was such a past master at self-promotion, and you said probably the first real promoter of himself in the modern age.
Certainly of a literary person. I want to say Lincoln had an iconographic figure. He was helped, I'm not being glib, by being assassinated. I'm serious. I mean, in the same way that JFK, whatever you thought of him, was memorialized by assassination in a way that who knows what another 30 years would have done. But of literary figures, I think it's fair to say that Twain in America and Dickens in England were the first superstars in the literary scene.
That's what I wanted to ask you, because Dickens was also serialized in the newspapers, and I wanted to ask you what Twain thought of Dickens' writing.
I'm going to say that at one time I probably knew the answer to that, but not tonight. I will say that the difference in the way I'm talking about them is Dickens was enormously popular. I mean, extraordinarily popular. A Christmas Carol sold more copies in the first week that it was on sale, 1840s, 1850s, more copies in the first week than all of Jane Austen's novels in her lifetime. Now that's not just because Jane Austen didn't sell a lot of novels in her lifetime, and it's not only because the Victorian reading public was much more literate than Jane Austen's world, an explosion through the Industrial Revolution and so on, but because it was Mark Twain. Charles Dickens. But Dickens, the iconography of Dickens is not what it is of Mark Twain. You close your eyes, you can see Dickens, but you can't miss Mark Twain. And it's not just because of Hal Holbrook. I mean, Hal Holbrook could partly do it because you put on that stuff, you look like Mark Twain. And you have to wear a white suit. Dickens doesn't have that same kind of branding. And Mark Twain, like Whitman, like Poe, was very self-conscious about cultivating the role of the artiste, not just being a writer, but being seen as a capital W writer. Yes?
Somewhat of a follow-up. With respect to his either moralist or self-promoter, to what extent did he participate in the newspapers of the day, in either editorial or in other capacities?
Yeah.
Was he a moralist, self-promoter, or both?
But you said with the newspapers?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, he began his life as a printer and a reporter, and I think throughout his entire life, even the tall tales have an element of journalism. That is, the nature of a tall tale is, I've been somewhere and seen something you haven't seen. Let me tell you about it. That's a very, very old form. But I don't think there is a tension between being a moralist and being a self-promoter. And believe me, I don't turn my nose up at his being a self-promoter. I mean, however many scores of you were here came out to talk to me, to listen to me tonight. I'm very gratified. I travel up and down the shoreline talking to people about literature. There's a kind of self-promotion in that. I did not mean it as a shot at Mark Twain. I mean it that I think they coexist, that he was quite serious that there was something wrong with the world, this kind of notion, and thought that he was one of the best people to point it out. I think that was, again, no tension between self-promotion and moralism. Journalism had the advantage that he could take on different guises, posing as somebody telling the truth in a way that we expect in a newspaperman, but we don't expect in a novelist. And so he has it both ways. Huck Finn purports to be an actual boy, and many, many people thought of him as an actual boy. Again, Huck Finn rather than Mark Twain. Yes?
How would you compare the way Mark Twain would have been interpreted in the South, let's say 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 70 years ago, with the way he's interpreted here? I tell you that grew up in a small town in the Deep South with very good English teachers in high school. And this interpretation would not have occurred because the emphasis was on the realism of what was depicted.
No. So I want to say, and I don't mean this, you answered your own question, you know better than I. I want to say that when teachers talk about Mark Twain as a realist, as a regionalist, you want to know what the South is like. Let's read The Life on the Mississippi, a great book. You got a real sense of it. You're reading Twain light. It's a great book, but it's not all of Mark Twain. I'm being quite serious when I say that I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and we took a master's degree course in the plays of Shakespeare, and we did The Merchant of Venice, which is another work that raises very difficult questions. It's Shakespeare, and yet it's a comedy. It's a comedy, and yet it treats Shylock despicably. And when the teacher of that course was talking to us as incipient teachers, he asked if anybody ever had the experience of taking a course in high school on The Merchant of Venice. And a kid from Georgia said, yeah, we did it. How did your teacher handle it? The kid said he completely ignored the role of, I'm not kidding, the Jew boy. Now, the student meant it as a way of saying, my teacher thought this was dangerous grounds. But he used the equivalent of the N-word. You see what I mean? This kid was from Georgia. And he thought that he was saying, my teacher knew better to leave it alone. But the fact that the teacher was right to leave it alone was revealed in the fact that he thought of Shylock as a Jew boy. You see what I mean? Larry McMurtry, a writer for whom I have endless respect, used to have, I don't even know if he's still alive, I think maybe he's not, but he used to own, and maybe he doesn't anymore, certainly he doesn't if he's dead, a bookstore in the Southwest. And he used to sell t-shirts that Larry McMurtry, and then the quote, one of the best regional writers in America. And that was his way of saying, I don't want to be one of the best regional. It's like she's a really good woman doctor. Very good lawyer for a blank, whatever it is. He knew that great writers aren't called regionalists. And so I think that there's a tendency for people who don't want to confront the whole of Mark Twain to make him a regionalist. I want to say the more and more you read him, you realize there's no borders to Mark Twain. That sounds like a closing line.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm grateful.